Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 99. Today's guest is Marisa Crane. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is Marisa Crane. Marisa Crane is a queer writer and intersectional feminist. She writes fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. She is the co-founder and editor of Collective Unrest, an underground resistance magazine, which contains art, poetry, fiction, photography, essays, and reports intended to promote feelings of humanity, social unity, political unrest, and urgency. Her work has appeared in The Rumpus, Wigleaf Top 50, Hobart, Pigeonholes, Pigeon Pages, and elsewhere, and has been nominated for Best Small Fictions and the Pushcart Prize. In 2019, she published the poetry chapbook Our Debatable Bodies with Animal Heart Press. So, I found my way to Our Debatable Bodies after Julia Dixon Evans wrote about it in the Voice of San Diego Culture Report over the summer. You might recall Julia Dixon Evans was the guest in episode 89. Here's part of what she wrote. Crane's poetry is somewhere between no-nonsense and intensely lyrically beautiful. Each piece vacillates between irreverence, fear, and shouldered trauma, but also with a profound sense of love. And that very much echoes my experience of the book. I found the poems to have so much motion in them, from one emotion to another to another. I've included a link in the show notes to where you can pick up your own copy, and I do recommend that. But if you want something extra special, I am giving away a signed copy of Marisa's book, so stay tuned after the conversation for details. For Patreon subscribers, Marisa has added a reading of her poem We Get to Talking About Dating Apps and I Remember How to the KTCO bonus archive that joins readings from authors including Liz Lenz, Rachel Zucker, Yin Yi, Michelle Britton Rosado, Julia Dixon Evans, David Bowles, and many more. The complete bonus archive is available to Patreon subscribers beginning at the $5 level, and you can find all the information at patreon.com/likewisemedia. One more thing before we get started. In the second segment, Marisa and I talk about the show Schitt's Creek, and there are some mild spoilers, including for the latest season, season 5. Now, I don't personally think this show is one that can be spoiled, but if you haven't seen it yet and you're against spoilers, maybe hold off and save the second segment until after you've seen the show. Okay, here's my conversation with Marisa Crane. So I was wondering if we could start with a reading.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
I'll pick this one that I actually haven't really read out loud, I think. Seems like a bad choice, but it's called We Don't Get to Choose Who We Love, but We Do Get to Choose Whether We Reject or Embrace That Love. I could have stayed hollow, but instead I chose a belly full of your dreams and a handwritten sign that reads, "Guess how many are inside." My coworkers folded their guesses and folded their guesses until they disappeared altogether. Some set the memory on fire. Others demanded to know where I'd gotten all those beautiful dreams. I shrugged and said, I found them. The office party sucked that year. No one spiked the punch because it wasn't a movie, and the winner never showed. I stayed home with you. I made it all worth it. The evenings when our feelings came running like a herd of blue wildebeest, even though the only threat to our becoming was what we might fail to do, if given the chance to choose safety over truth. Remember, the future is not safe. It, too, becomes a victim of the past. What we have is the here and now. You kiss my shoulder, and before I can confess that it is inexcusably dry, you are warming the lotion between your hands. You have given me so much that I would have never taken for myself. To you, I give my lips, my tongue, my eyes, my rest of my life.
You know, it's funny. Almost invariably when I ask somebody, I ask them to pick what they're going to read, they end up picking one of the ones that really stood out for me, like that I was thinking about a lot. That one, there's a lot about that particular poem that, like a lot of the things that stood out to me about this collection as a whole were present in this one. So like the first thing that really stood out to me, and this is true about the collection as a whole, but also about many of the individual poems, is how much movement there is in it. How at the beginning of the poem, it has like one kind of emotion and then moves into this other one. And I actually thought that collection as a whole had that feeling as well. And I thought that was really interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about, there's a poem in there. It's, This is the 10th Time, where, you write about, the speaker of the poem is writing about, my zigzagging brain. And, I guess one of the things that I think about is that, when I read that line about the zigzagging brain, it felt very familiar to me. Like it felt like something that my brain does that too. And there's times when it feels like in that poem, it's presented almost for laughs. Like it's something that's it's like a cute thing that, this is something that my partner is saying about me in a sort of gently kind of teasing kind of way. And for me, it's often the kind of thing where I'm thinking about it like almost as a flaw, like I wish I could concentrate on one thing,
right.
But as I was reading this and thinking about how so many of the poems have that sort of zigzagging quality, it kind of struck me that it might be something that's not, that there's something positive about it, that it enables something. But I wanted to sort of see what you thought about that.
I totally agree. And I think that I've been in the same position of like, is this good or is this bad or whatever? And like innately it's neither. It's really just like what you decide or how you feel about it. There's obviously times where I can kind of feel, stifled by it in a weird way because I can't focus on one thing, or I can't get one thing done because I'm trying to work on a million things, or I can't focus long enough to get a feeling out if I'm trying to express myself actually out loud or to a person, like, this is how I feel. I'll maybe get partway through it and then be like, oh, but it's because of this other thing, and then whatever. And it doesn't always serve conversation the best, but movement is one of my favorite things about writing in general, no matter what the genre is. Just the other day I was Googling like craft pieces about movement because it's not something that I've ever studied, but it's always been the one thing that I feel like I do decently well. It's hard to explain. With fiction, it can get weirder, but with poetry, I try not to put any limits on myself. So I just start a piece with a thought, and then, this isn't a new idea. Tons of poets do, but just the power of discovery, of seeing where it takes you. And mine tends to veer off in a few directions and then usually finds its way home back to kind of where it started, but in a new way. It helps me process things because it's like all of these different ideas are interconnected. Like, this is why I feel this way. And I might not even have known that about myself before. I was just like, all right, see what happens. Like, sometimes the poems are bad, like, and I don't publish those or submit those, but I still learn something about like, all right, this is where I was going with this, or like, this is why this idea has been haunting me for so long.
I find coming to terms with what my artistic process actually has been like the work of decades for me. I still don't know if I'm completely there yet. I find so much that when I sit down to write something, that if I don't know where it's going, like I just can't even start, like I don't necessarily have to know the whole path in my meander, but like I gotta know where it starts and where it ends. So I'm always really kind of jealous when I can hear people like, to me, it seems kind of scary almost, like to just start walking and not know where you're going. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, it absolutely does. And I've written so many things that I didn't know where they were going, and then they're okay, but I freeze during revision because I had almost no clear vision at the beginning of what I wanted it to be, so that I don't know how to revise it. Revision is absolutely my biggest problem. So I can run into that with that because I'm not sure what I even want out of it. But sometimes it's fun for me to like see where it goes. Usually I start with a line. With poetry, I might have a theme I want to tackle, or like a overarching image. But with fiction, it's almost never anything besides like, this line is really interesting and I want to make a weird character around that line or something like that. And that's fun to me to see where that goes.
So there's also this line that you had in another one of your poems in here. I think it was in in Yapping Dogs where it says, haven't you ever knocked over a bottle of nice scotch and wondered what the drunk ants talk about when they aren't working themselves into a dizzy haze? And I'm not sure I've ever specifically had that thought, but there are a lot of times when I find that I have, like, I wonder about stuff, and will say to like turn to my wife or like one of my friends and say like, oh, I was just thinking about it. Have you ever thought about that? And they'll just say, no. You know, but there's this way that can feel kind of isolating, you know, but it does sort of feel like it opens something up for the work, you know, like the ability to be surprised by the world, and to be curious about it, you know, like I sometimes I wonder if that's sort of what causes my, my zigzag, you know, is really just that I'm looking closer or more curious or something like that. I don't know. Now I'm starting to think like I'm tooting my own horn a bit, and that feels very uncomfortable.
You're not tooting your own horn. Toot it more. I feel like for what you're saying, like the isolation thing of like, no, people are like, no, like, what are you talking about? I feel like that's what the page can be, like your closest friend in so many isolating times. Even if you do have a partner and you do have wonderful friends and family, like, to me, if I'm feeling lonely or weird or anxious, if I just go write something, I feel like I'm talking to a friend or something, even if it's not me and I'm writing fiction. It feels like I'm hanging out with someone, which is comforting to me. That's just like, it's kind of the thing I turn to like time and time again. And I wonder if that's just what keeps people writing for a really long time, you know, throughout their entire lifetimes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are things that I can work out on the page that are hard to talk about, or that I might take a photograph instead of just talking about them. Either if it's because this is something that is, you know, somebody else would just sort of find it a weird conversation, or if it's because maybe it feels too big to be able to talk about out loud. I get kind of some sense of that, especially something like this poem that you chose. I mean, I don't know how it is for you, but a lot of times that poem is so intimate, especially it moves into more and more intimacy as it progresses throughout the poem. And for me, I often have a really difficult time expressing something that romantic out loud, you know, but it's easier to do on the page. Do you ever feel like that?
Yeah, I mean, it would be like really great if I could talk that poetically. I am by nature a super expressive, like sentimental person, which for other reasons I hate when people use sentimental in this weird gendered way, which I feel like is always subscribed to like females.
Yeah.
So out loud a lot, I am like, I love you, and like, this is amazing, and like, I'm so grateful for you, and like, look how cute you are. But you know, they're like these cute, small little sentiments. Yeah, out loud, I'm not like, well, so when this happened, and then we did this, and then I felt this, and then I looked over here. I will say, like, sometimes if like my wife and I get in a fight or something, I can't always like articulate why I was mad about something that like made no sense. So I might like write a poem and give it to her, or like leave it on her pillow and be like, I'm sorry. But generally I can work it out then, like why I flipped out about something like,
yeah,
that wasn't very big.
Yeah.
In the moment, I'm just like, this is making me mad. And then I generally reflect and then might write a little thing.
Yeah. There's something about that particular poem too, how there's a you in that poem. And there's a you in not all of them, in some of them, and the you in the different poems is very clearly not always the same you, like it, but I think the fact that that particular poem has, you know, appears to have a particular you in mind gives it this extra intimate feeling. And this is something that comes up for me in my own work a lot too, whether it's my writing or my photographs. Like a lot of my photographs are about the way that I feel about people who are close to me. And one thing I remember somebody, I went to a portfolio review once and I was showing this series of images of my family to a reviewer, and they said, like, it almost feels like I'm not supposed to be looking at this. Like this is something that's like, I feel like I'm intruding when I look at these pictures. and which I thought was like such an interesting thing to say. There's a way in which like some of these poems are so close, you know, and so intimate that it almost feels like, if not for the fact that you obviously put them in the book to be read by other people, it would feel like I am intruding, you know, as the reader. Like, I don't know, there's something about that tension between intruding and being invited into a moment, that feels really interesting to me. You know what I mean?
For sure. And did you take it as a compliment when they said that they felt like they were intruding on your photograph?
Well, I think that I took it as that I was doing what I set out to do, you know?
Right.
Because like, it's the kind of thing where I wanted the moments in the photographs to feel close and authentic, you know? To me, that was like an indication that I had sort of been able to portray something real.
Well, I guess I can't speak for all writers. I was just going to be like, oh, and what we all set out, or all artists set out to do is like break down these walls. But I guess not everyone does that. Some people just want to make something aesthetically pleasing. Mm-hmm. But that's never been my intention, really. Hopefully some of my writing is pretty, but it's always for me like creating this interconnectedness, like letting someone in and then hoping they like what they see, or if they don't like it, are moved or changed or impacted in some other way. But I've also like always been a really vulnerable person, so it hasn't occurred to me to like ever keep a reader at a distance or anything like that. It's pretty much one of my biggest strengths, like as an artist. What I lack in like certain technical skills, I can tend to make up with in like an emotive way. So I think I just lean into that because that's really all that I've known when I've gone to the page and been like, all right, what am I going to do here? Like, I'm not going to protect the reader from something, or like, I don't know, put myself in a house and give them a window, but like draw the blinds, like, or like put the blinds down, like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I just feel like if I'm going to do it, I might as well just like do it. Obviously, while respecting the people's boundaries of who I'm writing about, I wouldn't want to welcome someone in without my wife's like permission to be writing these super intimate things. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's the only balance, is like, if you're cool with being out there, like, then let's go.
Yeah. I mean, that is something that, like, for me, this originally came up as a photographer, but it also has come up in my writing to some degree, that like having to contend with the ways that I feel like it's got to be okay to tell your own story. But then I always come up against the fact that like my story isn't solely my own, because it has other people in it.
Right.
And I never quite figured out exactly, like, in a way that I could clearly articulate, like, these are my rules, you know, but it does seem like being aware of that sort of tension is important to the work somehow, you know?
It's one of the biggest things that I grapple with, in the sense of like, right, where is my own autonomy as like a person and a writer, that I have the story to tell, versus like someone else's privacy that's in my life. And I think that there's been a lot of writers in the past who have been very, very selfish and stubborn and reckless, and they want to tell their own story at all costs. And I think that that's a prerogative, but it's also, they probably isolated a lot of people and hurt them along the way. And that was what they decided was worth it. For me, that wouldn't be worth it, I don't think. And I'm not really talking about like family as far as like my parents or anything goes, but I mean, like, I want to balance someone else's emotions and boundaries with what I put out there. Trying to figure out like how to say this. It also goes along with like what I want to share with someone, as far as like, hey, I've written this thing, but you know, you might not be in the headspace to like read something like this. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that that's something I always thought about before, because I was so obsessed with this idea, like, oh, I wrote a new story today, like, here, read it, without taking a step back to be like, are you stressed? Are you happy right now? Or are you depressed? Like, how are you feeling? And like, are you even in the space to accept something like this and read it without it triggering you or just upsetting you or stressing you out? And like, so that's a whole nother layer of creation. Like, I don't have to share everything that I've written, like the moment I've written it, with every person in my life, because it's like, I don't know always what they're going through. So it's like, there's no way of knowing if this is going to be something that they're okay with reading or not. So that's just another thing I'm trying to be hyper aware of. Like, hey, where are you at? This piece is about this, and it might be heavy in X, Y, and Z area. Like, is that cool? Do you feel like that's something you can handle right now?
Yeah. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, what I always sort of come back to is like, I can do whatever I want, but then I have to like be willing to take responsibility for whatever the repercussions of it is.
Right.
I don't know. I want to come back to that thing that you were just saying a minute ago. This is like in a little aside about sentimentality.
Yeah.
Because that's
I would love to talk about that.
That's something that's like that's like a thing for me too. Like that and this started coming up with me when I started getting my photography reviewed, especially my earlier work, which was a lot more personal. And it would not always be men who would talk about sentimentality as a bad thing, but it usually was. And it's like, it's really interesting to me what you were saying about sentimentality being typically a very gendered thing, that it is more often sort of leveled as in a pejorative way against women and women's work. But I also kind of feel like I wonder if sentimentality is starting to have a moment right now, because I feel like there is a lot of stuff in pop culture and in art right now that is more, it's more willing to perhaps have that charge leveled against it and just say, well, the hell with it, I'm going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And I find that really fascinating, but also kind of exciting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you have like something specific you're thinking of?
Well, one thing that comes to mind just at the top of my head is like Steven Universe. You know that show?
No.
So it's like, I mean, it's ostensibly a kid's show, right? It's a cartoon, but it's one that like the central character is just so earnest all the time and people dig it, you know? But I guess I just wonder if like maybe we're having a time where people are starting to question what's so wrong with sentimentality, you know?
Oh, I agree. And I think that earnestness also is something that I love and value. And it might be something that people were uncomfortable with for so long that like, oh my gosh, this person like means exactly what they're saying. And they are so comfortable in that. People get afraid of that. Mm-hmm. Like, this person can't possibly mean this all the time and be this like honest, kind of like transparent, like you get what you get type of person. So I hope that what you're saying is, I hope that it's, you know, having a comeback. I've just, you know, seen a lot of books where the blurbs or the descriptions will compliment the book by saying it's unsentimental prose. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, okay, so they're basically complimenting like this lack of emotion and like ability to deliver something in a, I guess, more factual way or like matter of fact way as opposed to the person reflecting intimately. I don't know. It's hard for me to even understand what that type of compliment would mean. And it to me, it feels pretty gendered towards like women or femme individuals, like, because it's like, oh my God, they weren't over dramatic. Mm-hmm. They actually told this story without like kind of throwing this fit or like going into this emotional state. And it's like, why are we telling stories if not to feel emotional about them?
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you a story about going to the freaking grocery store and like just what all the food I bought was. And if I am, you're going to be really bored.
Yeah.
Unless I tell you like about some tragic story associated with the squash or a funny story.
I think too, like the times when I get that about my own work tend to be times when my work is sort of engaging with sort of subject matter, I guess, that has traditionally been seen as gendered feminine. You know, like if I'm writing about or making photographs about my kids and like my role as a parent and how I feel about my kids, that kind of thing, then that's one of the times when I get sentimental comes up a lot more often, you know? And it's always just interesting to me, like when I think about sentimentality, I feel like there's also this assumption that positive emotions are shallow and uninteresting.
Yeah, and then it's not serious art.
Yeah. But it's like some of these things are among the biggest and most transformative experiences a person can have. So why wouldn't that be a valid topic of art, you know?
Right, but because you're not, I don't even know. Just like, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit too about, you know, you were talking about connection. Mm-hmm. You actually used a phrase that I thought was interesting, which is one that I think people talk about a doors and windows kind of thing.
Mm.
You know, one of the things about this book of yours, this collection, is, what do I want to say? Like, what's the right way to describe it? I mean, it's super gay, right? And that's like important to it, right? Like that's important to these poems, is that like a lot of them are about gayness, right? And about how the world stigmatizes that, but also about showing the beautiful side of that, right? You know, to me, that's something that feels important. One of the things I think about a lot is like whether or not art can or should create connections between people across differences, like what our responsibility as artists is, especially if we are members of a marginalized community. You know, like for me, I'm not gay, but I am also not white, right? So like there are ways that I might be able to write about things about my own experiences that, and that I have written about in my own experiences, that people afterwards come up to me and say, that was amazing, or that was, really eye-opening, or I really connected with that, like white people talking to me about these kinds of things. And that's good, because that is what I was trying to do. But I always like kind of wonder, like, the thing I'm trying to settle for myself is like, do I have some responsibility to do something like that? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you mean to like kind of educate?
Yeah, I guess.
The majority. You know, I don't think that that is a marginalized person's responsibility by any means. I think that it can be really helpful if that's a direct result, but it's almost like as if you're writing with them in mind then, if that's like what you're considering. Like, all right, like how am I going to make this like absorbable or accessible? I think that that's kind of fucked, and that you shouldn't think that way. I thankfully have a million friends who are straight who never even like batted an eye at me being gay. It wasn't even like a thing. They were just like, oh yeah, here are gay people. Like, and then it's normal. And then all of our conversations are normal, and they're willing to listen about, you know, my opinions and my feelings, and with open minds and receptiveness. So I've been really lucky. And a lot of that comes from, you know, living here in San Diego. I'm saying this because I was thinking about my readings, and like, most of the people there were already my friends, so none of them were really coming up and saying like kind of that opened their eyes. They were more just like, oh, that was so beautiful that you write that way, like whatever. But it wasn't necessarily eye-opening that for them to like hear about these experiences, because I already talk about them, I think, you know, on a regular basis, and have these open conversations about them. But I guess just what I'm getting at is like, it can be harmful for a marginalized writer to sit down and kind of, I think Stephen King says it is like writing with the door open versus the door closed or whatever. He has something in his craft memoir about that. Like, I think you should write with the door closed at first, because like you can't consider other people's perspectives. I don't think you'll be necessarily like honest. And I think that often you can tell when a piece is like when you are cheating your own piece, if that makes sense. It won't come across as this really genuine thing. If you're already sitting down and thinking like, all right, who needs to hear this? Or like, how is this going to reach people? I more so think that you reach people by not thinking about them at all and sharing your like truest, most vulnerable self. And then that's when they can actually feel it, like off the page or at the reading or something like that. They felt that you didn't, like, you gave no fucks, and you were just like, this is what I think, and this is how I feel, and this is my experience, like unapologetically. I think that that's an intention that can like be transferred without you even realizing it.
You know, for me, a lot of times my own work is so explicitly about, like, I have this explicit intention of like, I want people to understand me.
Okay.
Like I spend a lot of my time not feeling understood and not feeling seen and not feeling like anybody, even oftentimes the people who are very close to me, like not feeling like anybody really knows who I am. I mean, that's not to say this is what you are trying to do with your work or anybody else is trying to do with their own work. For me, I that feeling of being unseen is a really motivating force for me in making the work at all, you know? So I always feel like there is something kind of presentational about my motivation to make art. And a lot of the art that I make is really specifically about like trying to put people
in my space and show that experience or that emotion or something like that to people. It's not necessarily to say that I'm thinking about how someone else will receive it. More, I'm thinking about how can I describe this in the most clear possible way, or not necessarily to say like clear from a language perspective, but just like that the experience of taking the piece in is accurate to what the experience that I'm trying to convey. So in that sense, like I'm looking more inwards to try and describe something specific, and unique to me, maybe, but it still has that impulse that like I'm doing all of that in order to share it with people. You know what I mean? It's like a difficult thing for me to sort of get my hands around sometimes.
Right. So, yeah, how do you feel about that? I guess those like competing.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I also think a lot about too, like, you know, people are always talking about like, oh, we're starting a dialogue, you know, we're having these conversations. And I think that's important. I was thinking both when I was reading your book and recently I talked with Liz Lenz, and she just had a piece come out in Time that was titled something like, how many stories do women have to share before we see them as human, or something like that. And even in this collection, you have, one of the poems, it's, I don't know the whole title, but it's like the old white man at the OB noodle shop calls his son-in-law a fag. That might have been the whole title. But like at the end of that, there's like this reference to like, you know, if you don't believe me, like you can watch me bleeding kind of thing. And you even also wrote a little bit about, over the summer, you wrote this piece for the Rumpus that was talking about allyship, and like, there was a line in there that you were saying that it begs the question, do most people only care about the stories they can relate to? And if so, what does this mean for marginalized individuals, particularly at the intersection of several marginalized identities? I feel like there is this way in which I want people, as a person of color, I want white people to be able to be better in certain ways, you know? And I know that this is something that a lot of women feel. They want men to be better, and a lot of queer people want straight people to be better. And just left up to their own devices, they don't. Right. Know? So that like somebody has to show them how to be better, but it's also like kind of too much to ask somebody to do that, you know? You know what I mean? For sure.
And obviously I have white privilege as a white queer person. So it makes me extra angry when in the Rumpus I was referencing the two white femme-presenting women that were in England that had been beaten up. The one girl, was a hate crime because they were on a date. Obviously a terrible, tragic thing to happen. And it'd be devastating to experience. But there were people all over my social media who I had never seen talk about all of these other issues, all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork and sharing this and about how terrible it was and how people had to care about LGBT rights. And a lot of them were white queer people who were sharing this. And I was just like, kind of like you're saying, like you want straight people to be better. Like, why can't you step outside of that and say that as a white person, you need to be better, and that, you know, all of these Black trans women are being murdered all of the time. And I don't see you kind of putting the same energy behind that, and even not even caring, but even knowing about it, like not educating yourself on what's occurring besides maybe seeing a story that popped up on your newsfeed in front of you and resharing it really quickly. I just don't accept someone being very selective in whatever their allyship tends to be, or whatever they think their allyship is.
It is the kind of thing that's, I don't know, it's difficult, right? Cause like for me, when things like that happen, when I see things like that on social media, it'll be like, I feel these twin impulses, because it'll be like, there's the part of me that is like, why is this the thing? Right? Like, why is this the thing? And like, you don't talk about it, these other things, right? And then there's also the part of me that's like, well, I mean, at least there's something, you know? So, I don't know, you know?
I think it kind of sucks to have that second thought sometimes. Yeah. Like, well, they're not, you know, they care about something, but it's like some people are so terrible as humans that we do grasp at straws as far as, I think giving people the benefit of the doubt for sure. But it's hard because you can't make someone care. Like, you can wave all of these signs in front of them, and if they're not feeling it, or they're just like oftentimes defensive, even if you educate them, you can't necessarily force them to actually feel it and care.
Yeah.
Even if they cognitively might be like, sure, like, I recognize that this is a problem.
Well, and this is the thing about art for me, is that, like, you know, because I'm like anybody else, I have my shortcomings and my ignorances and things like that, right? And, you know, I remember being a teenager and a young man thinking, just not really understanding a lot of things about, you know, like, even my mom is like a really ardent feminist and always has been. And, like, there were just so many things that I didn't understand about what she was saying when I was younger, in ways that I'm sure contributed to my being completely insufferable as a teenager. Try to give myself a pass because all teenagers are insufferable, but
yes.
But it's really through art. I feel like art gives you that ability to actually form a connection and see someone else's experience in a way that feels immediate, in a way that really nothing else does. And so that feels really important to me. Like, if there's any way to create this kind of compassion and empathy and understanding of each other, that art to me has been very transformative. But it's like, again, it's like, that's like a lot to ask of any particular artist, you know?
For sure. And I do think that there's a certain type of person who is moved by art. That someone is you. Like, you clearly, like, you emotionally react, it can transform you in ways. But I think that there are a lot of people who just aren't built that way. So if you presented them with a poem or a photograph, they could kind of just shrug.
Yeah.
And I've met a lot of people like that, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. They might just not be, that's not how they interpret the world or how they receive it. But then it's like, yeah, how do you reach them? Like, you just figure out a different way, open a different conversation. But I like what you said about the immediacy of art. Like, I can read a poem and it's only like 12 lines and all of a sudden I'm crying. And I'm like, how did you, a complete stranger, you know, get to me and do it in 12 lines?
Yeah.
And then, like, break me down. And it's like, that is what I live for, basically. It's like, how does that even happen? Like, it's fascinating. Paige Lewis, they have a poem. I don't know the name of it. It's something about, it's called When I Tell My Husband I Miss the Sun, He Knows. When I tell my husband I miss the sun, he knows what I really mean. He paints my name across the floral bed sheet and ties the bottom corners to my ankles. Then he paints another for himself. We walk into town and play the shadow game, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry for stepping on your shadow," and "Please be careful. My shadow is caught in the wheels of your shopping cart." It's all very polite. Our shadows get dirty just like anyone's, so we take them to the laundromat, the one with the 1996 Olympics-themed pinball machine, and watch our shadows warm against each other. We bring the shadow game home, and, this is my favorite part, when we stretch our shadows across the bed, we get so tangled, my husband grips his own wrist, certain it's my wrist, and kisses it. It's such a playful but intimate poem. It's basically what what you were saying when you were saying, like, you feel like you're intruding. Like, you're watching them kind of play about all day and play this, like, kind of innocent child game. But it's so immediate, and you feel like you're there watching them kind of prance around and be silly. And then it goes home, and it's like, you're still with them there and seeing that love. Like, that poem made me bawl the first time I read it. And I was not even ready for it.
Yeah.
I think that's some of the things that writing is awesome for. You're not really prepared for something to move you in a certain way. And then all of a sudden you're like, what is this? What am I feeling? Like, what's happening?
Yeah. Yeah. I think we need to take a little break, but we'll come back and do the second segment after that.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Schitt's Creek would be a great conversation topic for me.
For me too.
Yeah, it's really the only thing I can think of to talk about right now.
All right.
I have a lot of interest, but they've all been pushed aside temporarily for Schitt's Creek.
Yeah. We just, like last week, I think caught up, or maybe it was the week before, caught up with the whole, like up to season 4. And like we were going through it about as fast as we can with 3 kids and jobs and all that stuff. But for me, it felt like we were really tearing through it. So yeah, I'm interested to hear, where do you want to go first?
So how did you get started watching it? Like, did someone tell you to watch it?
Well, I'm extremely online. So,
right. Yeah.
So, I mean, it felt like the whole universe was talking about it, or at least all of Twitter was talking about it when season 4 came out, especially, and there's all the memes and everything. And I just figured, I guess I'm late to this party, but I might as well see what everybody's up to.
I was super late to the party too. Well, it kind of had its resurgence, right? Like it's been in Canada for years, but then when it came on Netflix, it's kind of got its rebirth. Mm-hmm. My one friend was like 3 months ago, she was binge watching it with someone, maybe a little bit longer than that. She was like, "Oh yeah, Schitt's Creek," and I was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And like, she told me the premise, and I was like, "I don't know. That sounds like Arrested Development to me." Did you ever watch that?
I tried to watch Arrested Development. I could never get into it.
But it's like that same premise of like these rich, privileged people losing all of their money. Mm-hmm. So I was like, I don't know. It sounds like overplayed, or like what are they gonna do with that that's like different or fresh? And I was just so pleasantly surprised. Even though I knew that it was really popular, I still went into it with a grain of salt because I was like, what do I care about this like rich, privileged family? Like, I don't care if you lost all your money, and like, is this going to be offensive or problematic? And which I think a lot of Arrested Development like is. They have some pretty offensive jokes, but I was just so surprised by kind of everything, the writing, the dialogue, the character development, all of their character arcs. Like, it was just not what I was expecting.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. And I think I was getting some of those same Arrested Development vibes in the first, like the beginning of the first season. Mm-hmm. And I was just like having the same thing. We stopped watching Arrested Development I think we maybe watched the whole first season, but it was just like, I didn't care what was happening on that show, you know? It's not that I necessarily think that pop culture or art characters have to be likable, but it's just like I hated everybody on that show and I didn't want to watch them. And what I thought I saw somebody on Twitter a while back saying something like, that Schitt's Creek was amazing because you realize that you're watching this show where everybody is awful, but that over the course of the show, they get better until the point where you would die for them.
That is true. I feel like with Arrested Development, like these characters are kind of stagnant. Mm-hmm. Like you're watching them for like the one-liners. Like you're like, oh, cool. They said that like, you know, like Lucille Bluth said this ridiculous one-liner and like that's funny on its own. But then it's like, where is it going? What's the purpose, I guess? And like Schitt's Creek had a lot of movement, if we're talking about that, I think. Like, meaning that they kind of do zigzag. Like they overall get better, but they totally like go back and forth between their old selves and their new selves. And they're almost like holding both of those identities at once for a long time, I think. The 4th season might be when they start to like embrace like, all right, like we are these people that live in Schitt's Creek. Like we're not these rich people anymore. Like, and they start to kind of shed that identity. For a long time, they're like holding them in a competing way, which is interesting to me because they say things that are kind of shitty. And then you're like, oh, like, why did they just say that? And then they redeem themselves in that same episode, right? And you like see that growth. And you're like, oh, I can't hate them.
Yeah.
Like, especially Moira, I feel like.
I feel like that basically is like every character on the show. What's interesting to me is I was talking about this when my wife and I were watching it, and we were talking about how it has sort of a backwards development arc to a normal sitcom. Like in a normal sitcom, you start off and everybody in the first episode, like in the pilot, they're being funny, but, you know, and everybody has like maybe one sort of character quirk, right? But that they're just people, right? They're like regular people who happen to have this one quirk. But then as the show progresses, it'll be like, that's all they are. Like they get weirder and weirder and weirder until they're like nothing but that quirk and they become really flat. Mm-hmm. Where like with Schitt's Creek, it seems like it's exactly the opposite, where they start off as these really broad types. And not just the Rose family themselves, but like everybody else in the town too. Like they all start off as these like broad types. And then as the show progresses, they get more and more complex and more like they feel like actual people. And that just like, I don't know if I've ever seen that in a sitcom before, you know?
I totally agree. And like, I feel like Roland Schitt is like a really good example of something like that.
And I was worried about him because I mostly can't stand Chris Elliott.
Yeah.
I hope he's not listening. It's unlikely, but sorry. I like you in this show, man. So.
Yeah, that character, like, well, I wrote, you know, in my obsession, like done so much research of like reading all of these interviews with Dan Levy and whatnot and kind of his thought process behind creating the show. And well, number one, he talks about like how when he approached his dad about making this, that Eugene was like, we have to make these complex like character histories before we write it in a show. And Dan was like, no, I just want to write the script. And he was like, no. And they set aside like 2 weeks where all they did was write every character's history down to like elementary school. Anything, the perfume they wear, like what music they listen to, what movies they liked, who they dated, like their entire history. So then he was like, then we knew all of that, and then we could use those things that we made up, those histories, to then like draw out different facets of them later on. Like they already had that built in, so they didn't have to think moving forward, like how do we challenge Roland or something like that, like because they already had his entire history written out for them, so they could just pick a detail of that person's past and maybe like throw it in there or throw him a jab or something like that. And that made me think so much about my own writing. Like, why aren't I doing that? And that, I think a lot of it comes from discipline, where I'm just like, I'm going to sit down and write something, which is obviously fun. But I think for longer projects, that's like invaluable. Like now you just know every single thing about this person as if they are someone real. And I think that's how it shows, like what you're saying about that show. Like they're real people because they have these entire histories that Dan and Eugene made up. Yeah. It's just really well done.
Yeah, I agree completely. I love how the acting on that show too, like again, like at the beginning of the show, everybody is really broad in their performance. And they get these little moments throughout of these just perfectly sublime little moments, and every character gets one, you know, at least one in a season. It's not what I expect from a broad sitcom, you know, but like there are these moments of transcendence. Like I'm sure everybody has already talked to death about like the moment when Patrick is singing at the open mic to David, and you're just like seeing all of these different emotions go across David's face as he's like trying to process what's happening. And it's just like that. I actually like started weeping at that moment, you know, like, yeah. And if you had told me that that's like that this show would have me weeping at the beginning, I would just not have believed it, you know?
Yeah. I think that that's a special talent to write something so funny, so engaging and compelling, yet also like so weirdly warm-hearted at all moments. It holds so much space and like does so many transformative things at once. And it's hard to understand how something can be that dynamic. What I was going to say before, thinking about Dan creating the show, he talked about how he wanted to turn the stereotype on its head of like small town America being, well, I guess it's supposed to be in Canada, but they also won't say where it is, and that it's whatever, small town wherever, that it's homophobic and racist and whatnot. Like he didn't want this small town to be portrayed that way, and he wanted them to have this chance to show what they're made of, like show that they are accepting. So he has that. Like none of the characters, like Roland, Jocelyn, anybody in the town, they never care that David's gay and that Patrick's gay. Like they don't even make note of it really. Like it's just like a thing that happens, and they're like, yeah, of course. And I think like one of those best moments is when Johnny is like talking with Roland at the, like, what does he have? Like the luau at his house, and Johnny's like, oh, my son is pansexual, and he's like having this little fit about it. And Roland's like, what? Yeah, he's into dinnerware, or like he says something stupid. And, he's like, no, he likes all people. And he's like, Roland's just like, well, you just let your kids love who you love, like whatever. And it's like this moment where it's like, people might expect that these like big city people teach, quote, these small town people like how to believe, but instead, no, like Roland is like, it is what it is, like embrace it. Like, so I just think it's like nice that he's kind of flipping these stereotypes a bit.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of it is really, really explicitly about challenging stereotypes, even like stereotypes around what kinds of stories we can tell around characters like this. Like there was that one episode where I can't remember what the rest of the episode was, but where like Jocelyn asks David to come into her class to talk to the like one gay student, and they're gonna like, it's setting it up like there's gonna be this like very special episode, heart to heart kind of thing. And the kid was just like, I'm not confused about my sexuality. Like, what are we doing here? That moment was so funny, but also like, it feels very authentic too, right? Like, it's like, we don't have to force these things. We don't have to, I don't know. It's at the same time, it's sort of taking on the discomfort that people might have about talking about things like that, but also it really just makes everything really normal, like normalizes all of that stuff.
Oh, I totally know what you're saying. I think like you said, it can be super flat to just have like one gay character talks to a younger gay character and like they connect. And it's like, no, we're these well-rounded people where like just because both of you, well, sorry, David's not gay. He's bi or pan.
Right.
But, this queer person talks to this other assumed queer person. I'm not sure if Jocelyn actually knows that.
Yeah.
I don't know. But it's like, yeah, just because these are two, like, these people have perhaps a similar identity, like, doesn't mean that they connect on anything else or even have, like, remotely the same experience. Mm-hmm. So, like, I agree with you. Like, I think that it could have been really corny if they went into this element of, like, having this deep talk, and the kid's just like, no, like, I don't need anything from you. And like, he wants him to like buy him beer or something. Yeah. And that scene.
Makes fun of his clothes.
Yeah. And David's just like, ugh, like, get me out of here.
Yeah.
I think it did flip that like a trope, or like kind of like and what in a different sitcom would have been this like heavy, like trying to be touching scene, but really would have come off as like disingenuous.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like when you're reaching for that, heaviness or whatever, you're like, it feels like they're doing more by like not having that, doing more by playing it the way they're playing it. They're actually doing more to make that conversation actually worthwhile, to me anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the whole element of Dan Levy choosing to like not have the like trauma porn of like having something terrible happen to these queer people in this town is just like, thank you. Like,
yeah.
He's said several times that like one of his intentions was to just show a healthy queer relationship on TV without like any of the terrible baggage or having anything like really terrible happen to them. Mm-hmm. It's just like, look, queer people have healthy relationships too. And like, this is normal. And you don't have to sit here like being like, well, what tragic thing's going to happen to them? Like, this ultimately can't end in happiness. And it's like, he's like, no, it can. And like, it will. And that's that.
Yeah. It's funny because like I remember when they first introduced Patrick as a character, it almost felt like he was in a different show from everybody else, because like just like his acting style, like his performance was so much more level than everybody else's. It definitely sets up like a lot of contrast for comedic purposes that works really well. But just like the way that he kind of anchors that relationship, I don't know, there's something that's so sweet about the whole thing, and it really, I just loved it. I don't know if I have anything articulate to say about it, but we can
just love things.
Yeah, that's true.
No, I agree. And what's funny is like, I'm almost nothing like David in any of the superficial or like obvious ways. Like, I wear sweatpants and I'm not very, I don't know, dramatic. I like outside, where I think that he does not. But I also feel like him in like a few ways in my relationship. Patrick very much seemed like he's the one that's grounding them, I think, in kind of this, like you said, like there's like this reality and this grounding, and David's kind of off, like, what about this terrible thing? Or like, what are you doing? And like Patrick's always just like there, and he's this consistent kind of presence for him. And obviously that's new for that character, for David to experience, like someone who's there and someone who's consistent and also someone who's communicative, like from the very beginning is just like, all right, like up front, like here's what I want. This is how I feel. And like, he's like, what? And then that's astounding to his character. Where I'm going with this is just that sometimes I feel like the one who will be like out in left field or be really emotional or sometimes build things up or spiral in a way. And my wife very much reminds me of Patrick, and that she's like steady. Like she's very different than I am in that way. She's a lot more like practical and logical, just like in how she approaches everything. And I see that in like their little quips, like with Patrick and David. Like David will have this like huge fit about like almost nothing. Like, I don't know, when they move the plungers to the front of the store and he is like, oh my goodness, like whatever. But Patrick's responses are always this like kind of even keeled like things, and they're very logical, and like he'll just be like, we have to get this done, and like David will be having this like moment, and he's like, it's okay, like I'm still here for you, but like we also have to go do the books right now. Like these like kind of things that I think bring him back down. It's kind of nice to watch it happening, not in my own relationship for once. It's nice to know that there's other people, even if they're fictional, kind of having that same experience.
Yeah. One other thing I like about their relationship, and this is something that feels very true to me, is, you know, I think in a lot of relationships, I don't know if it's necessarily true that opposites attract, but I think that we often find in our mates, we find something complementary. You know, I mean, I think there might be, there are ways that, you know, one partner might be, you know, more prone to outbursts, and one might be more level, one might be more one way, or I don't know, whatever, right? And I like that they present David and Patrick in these contrasting ways, but also that like it's not just that they're presenting this as David is the one who's always flipping out and Patrick is the one who's always like grounded and kind of right about stuff, because like Patrick fucks things up too sometimes, and they have a give and take that feels very real to me, you know, where it's not like Patrick always just gets to be the voice of reason, right? Like sometimes David is the voice of reason, and that was another thing that feels really true to me, you know, like when I think about the ways that my wife and I will talk to each other about things, sometimes there's things that she flips out about and I'm like level about, and sometimes there's things that I flip out about and that she's level about. And I think that's how it is in most real relationships, but it's not necessarily something you see on TV a lot, especially not in a comedy.
Right. I also think, you know, it's like, this is getting into levels of like a therapy session for me, because, it's like, I didn't even consider the fact that I can also be a person who grounds someone. I'm like, no, I'm always the one that's ridiculous. And like, no, that's obviously not true. But me like seeing that and interpreting that way, like obviously says something about me. But you know, also we also have like Alexis and Ted, who I think in a way are doing that as well, in a very different way. Yeah. But they're so radically different.
Seems like all the relationships on the show, like Jocelyn and Roland, and definitely Moira and Johnny, all of them have that element of, you know, something where they complement each other very well.
Absolutely. And, you know, when it first started, I was like, whatever, Johnny and Moira are just going to be this like kind of sexless, like old couple. And then they really surprised me with like a lot of their intimate and passionate moments. You know, like I think that was the first season when they like went off to that cabin that ended up not being their cabin. I think they like got into like Bob's cabin.
Yeah.
I think it's just like, it's so easy for me to like forget that people my parents' age are still like, you know, passionate and like crazy about each other, even amongst like all of the craziness that they're juggling in their lives. Oh my God. You won't have seen this. The beginning of the 5th episode. Can I talk about, or the beginning of the 5th season? Moira finds all of these love letters to Johnny, and she thinks that he's having an affair because she like doesn't recognize them and doesn't recognize the writing, and she's like throwing this whole thing, and she's like, oh my gosh, your father's having an affair, and like whatever. And she's like reading all of them, and she's like, this is fiery stuff, and like whatever. And like, spoiler alert, she wrote them like forever ago and didn't remember, and she had like been in the hospital, so she'd been like drugged up, and she'd had like an injury to her dominant hand, so she was like writing with her other hand, which is why she didn't recognize her handwriting. But it was just, I knew that that was where it was going immediately. Yeah. But it was still really fun because it was like introducing still that like fiery element of them, where you're like, all right, like these people, like they still really freaking dig each other, you know, after everything that they've been through. And it's not just like a, like, I think some people can let things slip into like a platonic kind of relationship after, you know, I don't know, decades and decades, but it's like, no, they're still hot for each other. And it's kind of interesting to see, is like, even though it's like a little gross.
Yeah.
I think it's just really cool to see how there's the like couples, but then like how all of the like families like, you know, grow together. Like, so you get like the couples growing, and then you have their entire family actually liking each other and wanting to be around each other.
Yeah.
And just how much they start to love that town. And at first it seems like they'll never want to be around these people, and then all of a sudden they can't imagine themselves being away from this town and all of these people. It's just, it's earnest, actually. Like, as much as there is like this sarcasm and humor, like I think the heart of the show is very earnest, and that might be why.
Dare we even say sentimental?
Yeah, and I think that might be why it connects with so many people, because they're like crying, laughing, and then they're crying, and then they're laughing again, and it's like underneath it all, it has like a pure heart, I want to say. Yeah. It has a good message, and we like that, even if we might try to claim that we don't, like we do.
I mean, it's just like something that I think so much about. You know, like I was thinking about, you know, another big popular show that ended recently was Game of Thrones. And I was thinking about like how universally, well, almost universally, the ending of that show was just like people hated it, and people were pissed off that it ended the way that it did. And a lot of people would talk about how like, well, this is really, the show has always been nihilistic. The show has always been very grim and very like, you know, people do things because they can, and not like, if you were expecting a redemption arc out of this show, like, were you even paying attention? And I was thinking a lot about how that show, you know, when it started, we were in the middle of the Obama years, and we had a lot of problems, but like, I think people felt like we were going in a good direction in a lot of ways. But just like at the beginning of that show and at the end of that show, the world is or at least felt like for a lot of people, like a really different place. And so the idea of a show that just sort of revels in the idea, like if there's any central ethos to Game of Thrones, both the books and the show, it's that like goodness is stupid. You know, it's like having morals was just going to get you killed kind of thing, you know? And there are ways that in our entertainment, maybe when we're younger and not paying attention as much, we might feel like that's a fun thing to engage in. But lately, when the whole world feels so much more urgent for a lot of people, it's not fun to engage in entertainment that's so bleak, you know? And so the idea of having entertainment or like a story that is fundamentally, the story itself has a good heart, to use the phrase that you used. I mean, that's something that people would have laughed about in the 90s. You know, it's something that people would have just completely turned up their nose about 20 years ago. But, you know, between something like Schitt's Creek, something like Steven Universe, which, and I don't know if you're into cartoons, but I love it. It's amazing to me. These, you know, even a lot of the music and books and stuff that I've been reading, poetry, we're having this moment where we're willing to engage with the idea that goodness is a thing and that it's a desirable thing, you know?
No, I totally agree. I have watched one episode of Game of Thrones ever. Years ago when it came out. I watched the first one and I didn't know what to do with it. Like, I was like, oh my God, there are so many people. What is happening? What are there 7 kingdoms? And I was like, I don't know. No. So I can't necessarily speak as much as I want to about your sentiment, although I understand not wanting something so bleak. And I think art is a reaction to politics often. They have an intertwined relationship, whether we want to or not. I know that it's like a super kind of tired conversation that keeps circulating of like, is art inherently political and whatever? But I think that like it just can't be, or I mean, can't not be. Just like I was saying, where is this person ready for this thing that I want them to read? Like, is this audience at large like in a place to be accepting of whatever this thing is that I'm creating? And like, yeah, maybe Game of Thrones ending years and years ago, that bleakness could have worked. But I think that that's why art evolves, and it is a reaction to the times, whether anybody wants to admit it or not. Like, some art is timeless, but a lot of the art that tends to be timeless tackles social issues that unfortunately don't go away.
Yeah.
No matter how much we like to think that they do. There's always oppression and discrimination. So unfortunately, pieces like that tend to survive a long time. And that's because we're still absorbing it in the way that author or artist intended however many years ago.
So there's one question I like to close with, which I like to ask everybody, which is, and we actually a bunch in both segments, we talked about this a little bit, but, the question is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I recently read the Book of X.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was right up my alley. I love vignette style writing. I love Department of Speculation.
Oh, yeah, I love that book too.
And then Mary Robison's Why Did I Ever is also hundreds of vignettes. That's very much a style that I love. I love the pacing of that. But the Book of X was so haunting and so beautiful and disturbing all at once. And I thought it did such a wonderful, like, artful job of tackling this topic of like how women's bodies are viewed. And I just thought taking that like kind of speculative element of, if that's what you even call it, of having this like knot in the stomach and having it be something that some people can actually see, as opposed to kind of like the cliche of like, oh, I have knots in my stomach or something like that when you're, feeling nervous. It kind of took that trope or cliche and made it something super fresh and original. I like devoured that book. I think I read it in like 2 days. It felt clean and messy at the same time.
That's interesting. So much of that book is like literally just gross. Like, I mean, it's like flowing with blood and viscera. And
right. I guess it means clean to me for like, I felt like the author just was so intentional.
Oh, yeah.
The pacing of it, the structure of it, everything was just down to the word is what I mean by clean. Like there was no spare word. So for as messy as like the content is, or the bloody and the meat and everything like that, it felt like nothing else was out of place. Like every single word had its intention and its power. That's why I love vignette style in general, just because I think that oftentimes authors don't waste as much time like with, I don't know. I don't want to say waste time because everyone can write about whatever they want, however they want. But just for me, I like to get to the heart of something immediately. And then it's typically more impactful when I'm reading it. So it just didn't go off in all these tangents. It kind of stayed at its heart in a very not in your face way. I think there's some books that can kind of hammer home a point where you're like, okay, I get it. But the book was just so fresh and innovative that that it felt like something I'd never read before, even though I inherently understood the premise so well and knew it intimately, you know, being born in a female body. Like, it still felt like there was a distance between me and the book, even though I was like, I know what you're talking about. I don't know. It was just something I can't really conceptualize, and I'm not really doing an awesome job of saying why it was so intriguing to me.
I think that book really speaks for itself.
It does. That's it. I'm like going to keep trying to redeem like my description, and I really can't.
I think it was great. Well, listen, I really appreciate you taking the time and talking to me. I had a good time.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm giving away a signed copy of Marisa's book, Our Debatable Bodies. If you'd like to enter the drawing, all you have to do is go to keepthechannelopen.com/giveaway and use the form there to sign up for our newsletter. If you're already signed up for the newsletter, no problem. Just send me a quick email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com and let me know you'd like to enter. And if you share the giveaway on Twitter or Facebook and tag the show, you'll get an extra entry. I'll be picking the winner on Wednesday, October 30th, 2019 at 1 p.m. Pacific, so good luck. And that is our show. You can find me and the show on Twitter and Instagram at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. And for all of your questions, comments, salutations, and cocktail recipe recommendations, you can reach me via email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. Sign up for the KTCO newsletter by going to keepthechanneleopen.com/connect. And every other week, you'll get updates about the show, as well as a curated list of poems, essays, art, and more from around the web. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on November 6th with a conversation with writer Kia Brown, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.